Well, it's a great pleasure to be able to offer a few remarks just at the end of this very interesting and rich day of discussion. And I also wanted to add my thanks to the Compagnia di Sao Paolo and this wonderful organization and thought that's gone into it, and particularly to Anna Cantalupi, who's sitting here. Um, I obviously also want to thank Gabriele Massaglia and Carmen Hoffman from the eabh. Um, I was wondering how to wrap up this discussion. Um, it was a unusual conference, I think, for the eabh, in that we went further back in time than we usually do. And I think there are some really substantial advantages, and we had them during the course of the day, of thinking about deep history over very long stretches of time. And we think, I think, in particular of the diversity of financial institutions, the different kinds of goals that financial institutions had when they were set up, the different visions that the founders and creators of them had, um, and the way that they interact with each other in a kind of competition. And we had a bit of this in the very last session, the story of a mutual insurance company versus standard non-mutual insurance companies. There's a competing landscape, and the question is, and I think it was running all through the day, and Lilia Costabile referred to this from time to time, that do we think that the globalization of finance is creating a kind of homogenization of the financial landscape that makes these very particular regional or local, or sometimes they've become very big and stretched out to a whole country, forms of business life obsolete? Are they yielding to international competition, or are there forces that keep them because of their embeddedness in local communities, and mean that the competition of different organizations and different business structures will continue to be an active part of the process of a dynamic evolution of a financial system? So there were, as we noticed, as Lilia correctly pointed out, there were pessimists who thought, yes, well, this kind of peculiar world of the British building societies that I grew up with is really disappearing, and there may be one or two left, but it's basically gone because they demutualized very dramatically in the course of the 1990s, and as a product of deregulation. Um, and then there was the optimistic element that we had, in particular from the beginning of the morning, the address by Rimi Ayadi, where she thought that new technologies made for actually a new viability of these local forms, and that the new technology was going, fintech was going to allow a new blossoming, 100 flowers blooming of different financial institutions and new financial institutions, things that are related more closely to local needs. So there was the pessimistic view, and then there was the optimistic view. And linked to that, obviously, I mean, there's a story in all of this, and I think there's a story in many of our conferences of how financial innovation works. And again, it was really satisfying, I think, to think of deep history going back a long way and thinking about how new institutions and new financial forms come into being. And we heard the discussion of how the institutions in the early modern Italy created a basis for trust and for credit, and we had the verbal lineages of these ideas: fiduciary and faith and credit and credo and belief. Um, it was really a happy story that was being told there about how new institutions can and new mechanisms, new financial forms can create a substantial amount of trust. And obviously, in a world where we're more and more permeated by distrust, this looks attractive and looks appealing. But I wonder also whether you don't need to think about the dark side of financial innovation, the underbelly of financial innovation, and the story of these beautiful institutions with beautiful names like Sao Paulo, or the Santissima Annunziata. So, do you think of this as a kind of quasi-divine story that's coming into human life? Well, actually, mostly at the beginning, most of the financial innovations are really thought of as diabolical rather than as angelic in their origins. And particularly this issue of paper money is just fascinating from this regard, the fede di crediti. And I think of the great episodes of 1720 in France, the simultaneous story of the evolution of the Mississippi Company and John Law's scheme, and the South Sea Bubble in England, where the caricatures are very, very clear. That it's the devil that is shitting paper money. And then in the French Revolution, the assignat inflation and the way that the news of the assignats are borne to Germany and even as far as Weimar, and they influence the court philosopher in Weimar, court writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And Goethe has in the famous first act of the second part of Faust, only published in the year of his death, he has the depiction of the assignat revolution as the work of Mephistopheles, that it looks as if it's going to produce universal goods, but it in fact sows mistrust and it provokes division. And so, I think of that as coming back to this issue. When we're faced with financial innovation, do we really think that cryptocurrencies are going to make the world more trustful? And do we think that they're going to create higher levels of local control of things? I would be very, very doubtful of that. And I think we're probably in the first phase of this, that is the creative phase, when lots of people have ideas. Some of them are quite good, but some of them are really destructive. And that the diabolical story may apply as much as the angelic story. There's a second note that I wanted to take up, because I think there was one line of conversation that went on through the day and focused on the discussion of profits and profitability. And there was this idea that there was a different kind of world in which profits are less important. And I think that is recognizable. And it does seem to me that actually there's an enormous amount of business activity, not just financial activity, in history, where profitability is not the most obvious or the most immediate goal. And there are all kinds of other motivations for doing things and being creative apart from profit. So it's a kind of important point to make. But it also seems to me to be a dangerous one. And in some of the discussions, and I think I'm grateful to Maximilian Martin for bringing this out on the table, you actually really want to think about how markets operate. And since we had a kind of often a reference to teaching and philosophy and the view of the Catholic Church on all of this, I thought I would have a brief citation from the encyclical of 2015, the Pope Francis encyclical Laudato Si, where the Pope talks about a magical wants to attack a magical conception of the market, which would suggest that problems can be solved simply by an increase in the profits of companies or individuals. Um, and it's an interesting quotation because it has this kind of quality of magic when things are created. But I think it's misleading. I very humbly suggest that. I think it's misleading to focus on the idea of profits because what is really driving markets is not profits but price signals. And price signals are really at the core of this. And when people were asking in the question session about interest rates and responses to local circumstances and what particular farmers are doing and what the differences in different communities, that is a story of market signals, of price signals that we all react to. And it's important to think of that, when we're thinking, for instance, of the global challenges ahead, the global goods ahead. And we're thinking of something like climate change and how we can act collectively in the face of a real threat to humanity. And obviously, it's also something that's at the heart of this document, Laudato Si. When we're thinking about that, we need to think of the incentives that there are. And if you think that we may be in a world in which there is very, very dangerous climate change in some decades, then you can see that there's a clear incentive to people who have substantial assets, countries that have big carbon assets, to realize those assets as quickly as possible and to put them on the market. And this is going to depress the price of carbon. And all of us, and this is not just financiers, all of us will react to that, that we will have cheaper air flights, so we will have more conferences like this, and we will fly long distances to conferences, and we will buy bigger cars that consume more gas. And we're reacting to price signals. And so, if you really think about how to address this, the only way of dealing with this is to alter the price signals. The price signals are the way in which we allocate things in markets. I think in the end, I learned a lot from the conference. I worried a little bit about the emphasis on profits. I think we need to think, when we think of the goals as a whole, as goals that we all can contribute to. And that also reminded me, who is setting social goals? That's a very important part of this discussion. Who is setting social goals? What process do we have to set those social goals? And I thought it was very striking. I liked the presentation that we had right at the end, very interesting, on the Spanish cajas that Professor Martinez Soto had. And I liked the declaration of the Spanish Confederation of Savings Banks in 1974, where it talks about the social demands, about the optimal use of resources. How do we determine those social demands? Well, the fact is that they can be determined very, very badly by the wrong kind of political institutions. And if you think about this, the story of the cajas in Spain was, unfortunately, over the first decade of the 21st century, a story of exactly that misapplication of resources for a collective work. So I went to Valencia on the eve of the financial crisis, and there was this spectacular development, beautiful, beautiful development, with a new opera house designed by Cultura, stunningly beautiful. Originally, it had been intended to be a television tower because the regional government had determined that um, the every great city in the world needed a television tower. But then they gradually realized that we're living in an age of satellite television. You don't need these television towers. And anyway, this proposed tower was in the flight path directly on the approach to the runway of the airport. So it was maybe not such a good idea. So instead of that, they said, we have an opera house. And the opera house was built, star architect, Mr. Calatrava, really beautiful. And it had some kind of defects, that there were many seats where you didn't have a good view of the stage. But then my host said, well, it doesn't really matter because they never show any operas here anyway. That seemed to me to be an example of where you have a socially set goal of what the social principles are that just misses completely the needs of ordinary people. And so, when we're thinking about designing financial systems, we really do need to think of that as well. And we don't want to have systems that are set up to artificially lay out what it is that is socially desirable. That's a choice that we all should be participating in and shouldn't be restricted and distorted by the particular structures of very, very peculiar local governments. So I've learned a lot from this conference. I hope you all have. We look forward to seeing everybody again next year in St. Petersburg and thinking about a different subject, but one which I think will raise, as all our conferences do, these very, very fundamental issues. So thank you, safe journeys, and see you next year in St. Petersburg.